His ordered bride ducked to clear the church door. The groom fainted dead away. The letter came back in March, 3 weeks after I sent mine out, and I stood in Heck Faulkner's post office reading it twice, because the first time I thought I'd misread the handwriting. I hadn't. She wrote in long, looping strokes like a woman who decided somewhere early in life that she had things to say and wasn't going to crowd them. The letter ran to 2 full pages, not what I'd expected. Most of the replies I'd gotten, 7 in all from the notice I'd placed in the Omaha paper, had been half a page, polite, cautious. A woman listing her qualities the way a man lists his cattle: hardy, experienced, no vices. This one didn't list anything. She just wrote. She said her name was Nora Aldicott, 38 years old, originally from County Cork in Ireland, then from Indiana, then from wherever the wind pushed her after that. She'd been married once, to a good man, she said, who died of a fever 3 years back and left her with nothing but a talent for silence, a strong back, and a general suspicion that grief doesn't kill you. It just teaches you what you're made of. She said she'd read my notice 3 times and decided I sounded like a man who wasn't trying to impress anyone. She said that was the first honest-sounding thing she'd read in a year. She said one more thing, right near the end before she signed her name. She said, "I am a tall woman. I mention this because it surprises men who expect otherwise, and I prefer surprises to come from me rather than land on me." I folded that letter and put it in my coat pocket and walked back out into the cold. I stood there on the board sidewalk outside Heck's post office for a good long minute. The wind off the plains had a bite to it still. March in that part of the territory is a lie. Looks like spring's coming, smells almost like it, then turns around and hits you in the face. My name is Calhoun Deer. I was 51 years old that March, which felt older than it sounds when you've spent 30 of those years working ground that fights you. I had a ranch 12 miles east of a town called Borden's Flat, 160 acres of decent grass, a solid house I'd built myself and added onto twice, a working barn, 23 head of cattle, and the intention of more. No debt. 2 horses worth keeping. I had been alone for 6 years. My wife, Ida, went in the winter of '74. Fast. She was fine at supper and gone by morning, and the doctor said it was her heart, and I said I know it was her heart. I know exactly which part of that heart gave way first because I was holding her hand when it did. I didn't fall apart after Ida. I want to be honest about that because I've heard men say they did and maybe they needed to, but I didn't have the luxury, or maybe I just didn't have the kind of insides that fold that way. I kept going. I kept the ranch. I kept feeding the cattle and mending the fence and doing the 10,000 small things that a working spread demands of a man every single day, whether he's grieving or not. I just did it alone. Alone is workable. I want to be clear about that too. I'd watched enough men remarry in a panic after losing a wife, like they couldn't stand the silence of a house, and I'd seen how that usually went. Rush it and you get the wrong woman, and then you've got a bigger problem than silence. So I waited. 6 years. I waited until the wanting wasn't grief anymore, wasn't loneliness exactly, but something quieter and more practical. I wanted a partner. I wanted somebody to hand me the end of a thing while I held the other end. I wanted to sit at supper across from somebody and have that be enough for both of us. So I wrote the notice, dry and plain like me. Man, 51, Eastern Territory, working cattle ranch, decent house, looking for a woman who wants a real life and not a fairy story. 6 replies, polite and short. And then Nora Aldicott from nowhere and everywhere. I wrote back the same day. We exchanged 4 letters before she agreed to come, and those letters are the most I have ever said to another person in my life. Not because I was trying to impress her. She'd already said she liked that I wasn't trying to impress anyone, and that felt like a gift I didn't want to waste. I just found that I could say things to paper that I couldn't say standing up. Things like, I'm not an easy man to live alongside. I don't say much, and what I do say comes out blunt and sometimes wrong, and I don't fix it as quick as I should. Things like, This ranch is everything I have, and I am asking you to share it, which is a large thing to ask of a stranger, and I know that." She wrote back, "You sound like a man who's honest about his flaws and arrogant about his virtues. That's the right way round." She wrote, "I'm not looking for easy. Easy ran out years ago. I'm looking for real." She wrote in the last letter before she agreed to come, "I will come. I want to say that plainly because I've noticed men of a certain type get anxious when a woman takes a while to decide, and I want you to know I've been deciding carefully, not reluctantly. There's a difference." I read that last letter at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me. Outside the window the prairie was just beginning to go gray. I could hear one of the horses move in the barn, a slow knock of hoof on hard-packed dirt. I thought, she is a particular kind of woman. I thought, God help me. She was arriving on the Thursday stage from Caldwell. I drove the wagon in 2 days before, put up at the Borden's flat livery, and spent those 2 days doing exactly the kind of thing a man does when he doesn't know what to do with himself. I walked the length of the town 4 times. I had a meal at the hotel dining room that I don't remember eating. I bought a new pair of work gloves I didn't need. Heck Faulkner found me leaning against the livery fence on Wednesday afternoon and said, with the particular kind of satisfaction that small-town men take in other men's discomfort, "You look like you're waiting to be hanged." I said, "Then you know how I feel." He laughed. Heck is a decent man, under the insufferable parts. He said, "She's still coming." I said, "Far as I know." He said, "What's she like?" I said, "I don't know, Heck. I've got 4 letters." He nodded, leaning on the fence beside me, and we stood there a while watching nothing much happen on the main street of Borden's Flat. It was a Wednesday. There isn't much that happens in Borden's Flat on a Wednesday. He said eventually, "Ella Marsh married a man she'd only known 6 weeks, and they've been solid 20 years. I said, "That's one story." He said, "Vic Dalton married a woman he'd courted 3 years, and she was gone inside a season." I said, "That's another." He said, "What I'm saying is you don't know until you know." I said, "I know that, Heck." He said, "You want a drink?" I said yes, and we went and had one, and then I had one more, and went to bed early in the livery's spare room above the horses, where the smell of hay and dung and horse sweat is about as grounding a thing as I know, and I slept better than I had any right to. The stage came in at 2:30 on Thursday. I was standing outside the depot with Heck and 3 or 4 others who had business there, or pretended to. Small town. The stage is still an event. The driver climbed down and pulled the door open, and a woman got out first who I recognized immediately as not her, because she was small and gray-haired and had a carpetbag the size of a loaf. Then a man in a drummer's suit. Then a boy of maybe 12 with a hat too big for him. Then the stage shifted on its springs. I want to try to describe this accurately, which is hard because the picture of it is so fixed in me that I've looked at it from a lot of angles over the years, and I still don't quite have the words. She had to turn sideways to get through the door, not because she was wide, she wasn't wide, because she was tall. She ducked her head coming through, one clean duck, no fuss, the way a person does who's been ducking through doors their entire life and stopped thinking about it. She came down the step. She straightened up. 6 feet, maybe a shade over. She had dark hair pinned up under a plain brown hat and a traveling dress that was the color of Good Creek clay. She had shoulders like a woman who'd actually worked for things. Her face was, I don't know, not beautiful in the way that word usually gets thrown at women, something better than that. Strong-boned, weathered in a way that meant she'd been outside for most of her life, and that was fine with her. Her eyes were gray-green, which I found out later, but from where I was standing all I could tell was that they were the color of winter water, and they were already moving across the crowd, looking for me. Behind me Heck said very quietly, "Lord Almighty." He said it the way a man says something when it just gets away from him. One of the other men, I think it was Corbin from the feed store, made a sound. I was not doing any of that. I was standing still, which is what I do when I don't know what else to do, and she found me with those eyes and she stopped. Not a long stop, a second, maybe two, just enough for me to understand she was assessing the same as I was, and she wasn't in a hurry about it. Then she walked toward me. Her stride was long and unhurried. She covered ground the way a good horse does, not rushing, not dawdling, just moving like moving was natural. She stopped about 3 feet from me and said, "Mr. Deer." Not a question, she'd figured out which one I was. I said, "Miss Aldicott." She said, "It's Nora." I said, "Cal." She put out her hand, not the tips of her fingers, which is what a lot of women do when they're being introduced, but her whole hand, palm to palm. I shook it. Her grip was solid. A person's grip tells you things, and hers told me she wasn't performing anything. We stood there a moment in the dust and the noise of the unloading stage. She said, "You look about like I thought." I said, "You look," and I stopped because I wasn't sure how to finish it without saying something she hadn't asked for. She said almost to herself, "Go on then." I said, "You look capable." Something moved across her face that might have been amusement. "That'll do," she said. Behind me, I heard something and turned to see young Tom Greer from the land office sitting down very suddenly on the depot step. Someone was bending over him saying his name. Nora looked past me at Tom. She said flatly, "That happen often." I said, "Tom Greer faints at least once a spring. Usually it's the heat." She looked at the sky, which was overcast and cold. She said, "It's not the heat." I picked up her trunk. It was heavy, real heavy, the kind of weight that means books or iron or both. I hoisted it without ceremony, and she watched me do it without offering to help, which was exactly right. We walked to the wagon. "I want to tell you about the drive back to the ranch, and I want to tell it right because it matters." 12 miles of open country on a cold Thursday afternoon. 2 people who have written each other 4 letters apiece sitting on a wagon bench close enough that when the wheels hit a rut her shoulder pressed mine for a moment before we separated. We didn't talk a lot. I noticed that she didn't fill the quiet the way some people do, with chatter, with questions, with the nervous noise of a person who can't stand silence. She just sat with it. She watched the land go by, real watching, not polite looking, the way you watch something you're trying to understand. About 4 miles out, she said, "That canyon running south." I said, "Deer Creek." "Runs year-round." She said, "Cottonwoods." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." That was it for a while. Then, coming up over the last long rise before the ranch came into view, she said, "Is the soil more clay or more loam this far east?" I said, "Mix of both. More clay in the low ground, better loam on the benches." She said, "I had a kitchen garden in Indiana, 6 years. I want one here if the ground allows." I said, "The ground allows." She said, "Good." The ranch came into view then, down the slope and across the flat. The house first, which is a solid 2-story frame with a porch I added the second year. Then the barn behind it. Then the scatter of outbuildings, the fence lines running out to the horizon in both directions. I didn't say anything about it. Didn't introduce it or try to frame it. Just let her look. She looked for a long time. Then she said, "You built that?" Not a question. I said, "Most of it." She said, "The porch too." I said, "Second year I had the place." She said, "Why the second year?" I said, "Because the first year I didn't have time." She said, "And the second year you did." I said, "The second year I got better at managing the time." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "You built a porch when you didn't have to. When you were alone." I said, "A man wants somewhere to sit at the end of the day." She said very quietly, "Yes." And then she didn't say anything else, and I understood somehow that she'd heard something in that she hadn't expected to hear, and that it had landed differently than I'd intended, and that whatever it had landed as, it was a good thing. We pulled up to the house. I set the brake. I got down and she got down on her own side, which told me something too. I'd had it in mind to help her down, but she didn't wait for it or want it. I said, "I'll show you the house." She said, "After." She stood there looking at the front of it for a moment, the porch, the door, the windows. Then she said, "Can I see the barn first?" I said, "All right." So we went to the barn first, which is not something I'd expected to do with my mail-order bride on the day she arrived, but there it was. I showed her the two horses, the bay and the roan. She ran her hand along the bay's neck, the flat of her palm, slow and deliberate, and the bay leaned into it. She checked the roan's left foreleg, which had a small swelling I'd been watching, and said, "How long has that been there?" I said, 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. She said, "It's nothing serious yet. Keep it wrapped when he works." I said, "You know horses." She said, "My father kept them." "And my husband." She said her husband's name like that, my husband, the way a person says something they've learned to say cleanly, without it catching. I respected that. She looked at the cattle pen, the feed situation, the water arrangement. She asked 2 or 3 questions that told me she'd worked with animals before, not delicate questions, practical ones. Then we went into the house. I had cleaned it. I want you to know that. I had spent 2 days before I left for town cleaning that house in ways it had not been cleaned in some time. I am not an untidy man, but I am a man who lives alone on a working ranch, and the kind of clean a working man keeps is not the same kind of clean as what I'd done that week. I had scrubbed the floors. I had taken the curtains, which had been Ida's curtains and which I had not touched in 6 years, and beaten the dust from them and hung them back. I had put fresh oil in the lamp on the kitchen table. I had put a jar of dried sage on the windowsill, because it was the only thing in the house that resembled something decorative, and I thought it might matter. She walked through the kitchen slowly. She touched the surface of the table, long table, solid, 4 chairs. She looked at the stove, the shelves, the window over the sink. She said, "You have good natural light in here." I said, "South-facing." She said, "The shelves need another bracket here." She touched a spot on the middle shelf where the wood bowed slightly. She was right. I'd been meaning to fix it for a year. She went through to the front room, looked at the fireplace, the mantel, the 2 chairs I'd arranged in front of it with no particular system. She said, "The chairs are facing each other." I said, "That a problem?" She said, "No, it's no." Again that thing moved across her face that I couldn't name. "It's fine," she said. She went upstairs. I followed. There were 2 rooms up there, mine, which I'd made as decent as I could, and the small room at the end of the hall that had been a kind of storage room, and which I'd cleared and put a bed in and a chest. I'd put clean linens on the bed. I'd found a small mirror that had been in a box and hung it on the wall. She stood in the doorway of the small room and looked at it for a moment. She said, "Is this?" I said, "This is yours if you want it, separate, until you decide how you want things to go." A long pause. She said, "That's you arranged this." I said, "You're a stranger still. I thought you should have somewhere that's yours." She turned and looked at me in the hallway, and I couldn't tell you exactly what that look was, but I can tell you that it was not polite or grateful in the surface way. It was something deeper. Like I'd said something that matched up with something she'd been waiting to hear, and she hadn't known she'd been waiting until it matched. She said, "Mr. Dear Cow." I said, "Yes." She said, "I think this is going to be all right." I said, "I hope so." She said, "I don't mean all right like I'm settling. I mean," she stopped. "Then, in Indiana, when I answered your notice, my neighbor said I was making a desperate choice. I want you to know I didn't come here desperate. I came here because you sounded like a man worth the trouble of a long trip." I didn't say anything to that. I'm not sure there was anything to say. She nodded once, like she'd settled something herself, and went back downstairs. We were married 9 days later. I would not say those 9 days were comfortable exactly, but they weren't uncomfortable either. They were calibrating, maybe. Two people in a house learning the size of each other. She rose early, which suited me. She cooked without being asked to and without making anything of it, the way a person does who understands that there's work to be done and somebody has to do it. She was a good cook, plain and solid, which is all a working man needs. The first morning she put a plate in front of me and poured coffee and sat across from me and ate her own food, and we didn't say much, and it wasn't awkward. It was just breakfast. She worked. This surprised me, not because I expected her to be idle, but because I expected to have to show her more. She didn't need much showing. She watched something once and then did it. She had the kitchen garden staked out and turned over by day 4, working the clay-heavy low corner of the yard with a fork, and when I offered to take a turn she said, "I've got it," and she did. She had opinions, which she expressed without preamble. The first time she said outright that I was wrong about something. It was about how I was rotating the cattle through the south pasture, and she had a point, and I told her she had a point, and she said, "All right then," and that was that. No gloating, just the satisfaction of a practical thing settled. The evenings were what I thought about most during those 9 days. We would sit on the porch, the chairs I'd moved out there on day 2 without being asked, and she would sometimes read, and I would sometimes mend harness or just sit, and the light would go down over the plains in that particular way it does, going pink and then orange, and then the long gray slide into dark, and she would watch it. One evening she said, out of nowhere, "Did you and your wife sit out here?" I said, "Not as much as I should have." She said, "How long were you married?" I said, 17 years. She said, "She died on this place." I said, "Yes." She was quiet a while, then, "I don't want to walk around her like she's a sore spot. She was your life for 17 years. That deserves to be here somewhere." I said, "She was a good woman." She said, "So I gather from the way you built the porch." I looked at her. She said, "A man who builds a porch when he's alone is a man who still believes there's someone to sit with, even when there isn't." I did not know what to do with that, so I said nothing, and after a while she went back to her book, and the light finished going down. We were married at the Borden's flat church on a Tuesday. I'd asked Reverend Caulfield 2 weeks before, and he'd been agreeable in that particular way that small-town reverends are when a widower who hasn't given them much trouble in 6 years asks for a simple thing. The word had gotten around, of course. The word always gets around in a place the size of Borden's flat. I wore the suit I'd worn to Ida's funeral and to one other occasion I don't remember, which tells you how often I wore it. It still fit, though the shoulders were tight in a way they hadn't been once, which I suppose is what years of physical work does to a man. I didn't think much about my appearance. I had long since stopped thinking about my appearance. It seemed beside the point. We drove in together on the wagon, which caused some interest among the people who had gathered outside the church, and there were more of them than I'd expected or wanted, but it was a Tuesday morning in Borden's flat, and there wasn't much competition for entertainment. I helped Nora down from the wagon this time, because she was wearing a dress she'd brought from Indiana, a blue-gray dress that was clearly her best but that she wore without ceremony, and the step was high and the ground uneven. Her hand on my arm was warm, and her grip was steady. We walked into the church together, and the pews were fuller than they had any right to be for a quiet Tuesday ceremony. Heck was there, of course, Corbin from the feed store, the Marsh family. About 15 others who had no particular connection to either of us except curiosity, which is its own kind of connection in a small town. Reverend Caulfield stood at the front, hands folded, looking pleasantly neutral the way ministers do when they want to project calm. We walked up the aisle together. Caulfield began. I was standing beside her. She was just a half-inch shorter than me in those boots, which put us closer to eye level than I'd ever stood with a woman. And I was listening to the words, which I'd heard before at 2 other weddings, and I was thinking about what those words mean when you're 51 years old and you've already buried the first person you said them with and you're saying them again. It's a different thing the second time, not a lesser thing. Just different. You know more about what they cost. He got to the vows. She said hers in a clear voice, steady, looking at me straight on, and I said mine, and I meant them. And I believe she meant hers, though I was aware in the back of my mind that neither of us knew yet what we'd actually taken on. Then Reverend Caulfield said we were married. I didn't kiss her on ceremony. I'd thought about this and decided against it. It felt like a performance in front of a church full of mostly strangers, and I had never liked performances. So I did what came naturally, which was to take her hand, the way I'd shaken it at the stage depot, only this time I held it. She looked at me. Her gray-green eyes were even. She said very quietly, just between us, "That's it then." I said, "That's it." Behind us, Heck started the applause and the others followed, and we turned and walked back down the aisle, her hand in mine, into the noise and the light. That was the start of things. What came after was the real substance of it, and I want to tell it right because it's where the truth is. The first year was the learning year. 2 strangers in a house is a particular kind of hardship, even when the strangers are willing. You find the places you don't fit and you work around them, or you file them down. You discover that the other person has habits and rhythms and private ways of being that are entirely their own and not going to change, and you decide whether you can live alongside those or whether they'll drive you to the edge. Nora rose before I did, which I hadn't anticipated. Most mornings I was up before the light, had been for 30 years, and I was accustomed to having the kitchen to myself at that hour. That particular hour when the darkness is starting to loosen, and the whole quiet world belongs to the man who's awake in it. The third morning I came downstairs to find her already at the stove with coffee going and flour on her hands, and I stopped in the kitchen doorway and she looked up and said, "Go ahead and sit. It's not ready yet." I said, "You don't have to do this." She said, "I'm aware of that." She went back to what she was doing. "I get up early, it's how I'm made." After that, I stopped offering an explanation for her own behavior back to her. She was quiet in the mornings. Not unfriendly, she'd hand me coffee and ask a question when she had one, but essentially quiet, which I understood because I was quiet in the mornings too, and the quietness was not awkward between us, which told me something. Some people can share silence and some people can't, and the ones who can't tend to panic and fill it with noise, and Nora did not panic and did not fill. She just moved through the morning the way she moved through everything, with a kind of concentrated ease that I had to look at carefully before I recognized it for what it was. Competence, not the performed kind, the real kind that lives in the hands. Nora had opinions about everything, and specifically about the way I ran the ranch, which she expressed freely and was right about often enough that I learned to listen even when I didn't want to. She thought I undervalued the east pasture. She was right. She thought the cattle were too light going into winter and we needed to adjust the summer grazing rotation. She was right about that too. She had a way of saying things flat and plain, no hedging. Just the thing that in another person might have felt like a challenge but in her felt like honesty, which I respected because it was the same way I talked. She had an eye for what was wrong with a thing before the thing broke. "The pump handle on the barn well," she said on day 12, "that handle's going to fail at the joint." I looked at the handle and didn't see it immediately, but I went over it carefully that evening and there it was, a hairline crack at the collar, just starting. If I'd let it go another 2 weeks it would have broken in the cold, which is the worst time a pump breaks. I fixed it the next morning. She never said anything about being right. She just nodded when I showed her the crack and said, "Good," and went back to what she was doing. I started paying attention to what she said. Not performing attention, not being polite, actually turning it over and thinking about it, because she had earned that by being right more than she was wrong, and a man who doesn't update his behavior based on evidence is a fool. We argued, not often but solidly when we did. The second month, we had a disagreement about selling one of the horses that ran 3 days, neither of us giving ground, and on the evening of the third day she came out to the barn where I was working and she said, "You're wrong about the price and right about the timing," and I said, "I know," and that was the end of it. I found out later from Heck that she had gone and asked Marta Sousa's husband what the horse market was doing. She'd looked into it herself quietly without mentioning it to me and formed her own conclusion and then come and stated it. She didn't tell me about the research. She just told me what she'd decided. I appreciated that. It meant she was arguing from knowledge, not just position. In bed, she was practical and present and not performing anything, which is exactly how she was everywhere else. And after a while, I stopped being surprised by that and started being grateful. She planted her kitchen garden and tended it with the patience of a woman who understands that things grow at their own speed and cannot be pushed. By June, it was producing. By August, it was producing abundantly, and she put up more preserves than we'd need in 2 winters. She had a particular method with the tomatoes that she said she'd learned in Indiana, and I watched her do it once. The way she moved in a kitchen when she was deep in a task, fluid and certain, not wasting emotion, and I thought of how different every person's knowledge is. How much there is in any one person that you'd never know if you didn't pay attention. The roan's leg healed. She was the one who caught the thing with the far gate latch that would have let the cattle out eventually. She was the one who noticed the weather change early in October, a kind of peculiar stillness in the air before the pressure shifted, and said we should move the cattle in a day early. We did. The storm came harder than predicted. The cattle were fine. The east pasture turned out to be better ground than I'd used it for, and we added 8 head by fall. These are not remarkable things. They are the small increments of a working life going in the right direction. But I want to say them because the small increments are what a real life is made of, and I spent too many years not paying attention to them. There was one morning in October, maybe 7 months in, when I came in from the early barn check, and she had made porridge, and there was a cup of coffee sitting on the table at my place and steam coming off it. And she was at the sink doing something with her back to me, and I stood there in the kitchen doorway with mud on my boots and the cold still on my coat and that cup of coffee sitting there, and I had the feeling of coming home. Not arriving, coming home. The difference is the difference between a house you built and a place that holds you. I hadn't had that feeling in 6 years. I stood there in the doorway and I felt it like a physical thing in my chest. She turned and said, "Porridge is ready." I said, "All right." I came in and sat down and drank the coffee, and the morning went on the way mornings do. But I marked it inside, and I have kept it. It was about 8 months in that I started to understand something I hadn't expected. I'd gone into this, I'll be honest, with a certain set of expectations that were modest by design. I expected a workable arrangement, a practical partnership between 2 adults who were too old for illusions. I expected competence and reasonable company and the absence of loneliness. I had not let myself expect more than that because expecting more than that, at 51, with 6 years of alone behind you, feels like a kind of hubris. She disassembled that piece by piece without seeming to try. There was an evening in November, the first winter snow coming in off the north, the kind of weather that closes a place down and puts everything close and small, when we were sitting at the kitchen table after supper and she'd brought out a map. Not a decorative map, a working surveyor's map of the county, folded and marked. She said, "Have you ever thought about the Hendricks parcel?" The Hendricks parcel was 80 acres adjacent to my north fence line, owned by a man who'd been trying to work it and failing for 3 years. I'd thought about it, in the abstract way you think about things you don't think you can afford. I said, some. She said, he'll sell in the spring. He doesn't know that yet, but he will. His water situation gets worse every dry summer and he's borrowed against the land twice. I said, you know this. She said, Vera Hendricks told me. She said it without any particular satisfaction, just the fact of it. Women talk, it's useful. I said, what are you suggesting? She said, I'm suggesting that if we manage the winter cattle right, and then she laid out a plan. A specific, practical, detailed plan for getting the ranch to a position where we could make an offer on that land in the spring. I'd thought about expanding in the vague way that men think about things they believe they can't have. She had thought about it in the precise way that a person thinks about something they believe can be done. I sat there listening to her, and I had the strange sensation, strange because I hadn't felt it in years and hadn't been looking for it, of being known. Not just liked or tolerated. Known. She'd learned the ranch the way she'd learned the horses, with real attention, and she'd made a plan that could only have been made by someone who understood both what I had and what I wanted. I said, you've been thinking about this for a while. She said, since September. I said, you could have said something in September. She said, I wanted to understand it better first. She looked at me across the table. You don't like half-thought ideas. I said, how do you know that? She said, Cal, I've been living with you for 8 months. I looked at her face across the kitchen table in the lamplight with the snow tapping at the window, and I thought, she sees me. Not the version of me I try to present, not the self-sufficient widower rancher who doesn't need anything. The actual thing. The man who built a porch when he was alone. The man who was right about the timing and wrong about the price. The man who gets things wrong and knows it and takes a day to admit it, but does admit it. She saw that man and she was still here, across the table making plans. I said, all right. She said, all right what? I said, let's think about the Hendricks parcel. She said, we're doing more than thinking. I said, yes. She held my gaze for a moment and something passed between us that I don't have a word for. Not sentiment. Something steadier than that. The recognition of two people who have looked at each other plainly and decided without fanfare that this is the one. The Hendricks parcel came onto the market in March, just as she'd said it would. We made the offer. Old Wendell Hendricks looked at me across his kitchen table with the resigned look of a man who knows he's out of options and is glad to be done. And he shook my hand and said the land was mine. On the drive home, Nora sat beside me on the wagon, and the sky was that particular clear cold blue that March gets sometimes, the last gasp before the mud season, and I turned to her. I said, you were right. She said, I usually am. I said, don't get used to saying that out loud. She said, not quite smiling but almost, too late. I drove on. After a while she put her hand over mine on the reins, not a big gesture, just a hand laid over a hand. She didn't look at me when she did it and I didn't look at her. We just drove. 240 acres now, good water. Better grass than I'd had 2 years before. And a woman beside me who'd made the map, thought through the problem, and never once asked for credit. There was an afternoon midsummer of the second year that I have never told anyone about. I am going to tell it now. I was working the new fence line on the north boundary of the Hendricks parcel, dear land now, all mine and hers, and it was hot, dry July work, post by post, the kind of work that takes everything you have and gives nothing back. I'd been at it since first light. My hands were bleeding at the knuckle from the wire. My back was wrong. I'd tweaked something 3 days before, and by mid-afternoon it had moved from wrong to not good. I finished the last post I had materials for and I sat down in the shade of it, which was approximately the width of a fence post, which was not much shade. I drank the last of my water. I sat there with my arms on my knees and my head down. I was not in a good way, not dramatically. I wasn't dying. I was just worn down in the particular way a man gets worn down when he's 52 and he's been working hard ground alone most of his life, and the summer is hot and the back is bad. And in that state, the thought that comes isn't dramatic either. It's just, what is all of this for? I had felt that thought before, after Ida, not that often but some. I sat there with it for a while. I heard hoofbeats coming down the fence line, the bay. She'd saddled up and ridden out. She came around the corner of the new fence and pulled up and looked down at me, and I looked up at her. She had a canteen on the saddle and a cloth wrapped around something. She got down. No comment on me sitting in the dirt with my head down. She just sat down next to me, flat on the ground, back against the fence post, and handed me the canteen. She unwrapped the cloth, biscuits from that morning left over. We sat there in the narrow shade of the fence post and ate without saying much. The heat came up off the ground in slow waves. A meadowlark started up somewhere east of us and went quiet. I said finally, "My back is bad." She said, "I know. You've been walking like it's bad for 3 days." I said I should have stopped at noon. She said, "Yes." I said, "I'm going to need a day." She said, "I know," a pause, "I can finish this section." I said, "It's hard work." She looked at me. I said, I know you can." She said, "What else?" I said, "What do you mean, what else?" She said, "You're not just tired, what else?" I looked out over the flat north country, which was all mine now, which should have felt like enough, and I said, "Sometimes I wonder if I'm equal to all of it." It was the most I'd said in years. She was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable quiet, thinking quiet. She said, "You finished the south fence in 2 days last spring alone when the weather turned and you had 48 hours before rain." She said it the way she said most things, plain, no drama. "You've grown this place from 160 to 240 in 2 years. The cattle are healthy. The house is solid. The mortgage is paid." She paused. "You're equal to it. You've been equal to it." I said, "Doesn't always feel that way." She said, "Feelings aren't receipts." I looked at her. She said, "The work is the receipt, and the work says you're more than equal to this." I didn't say anything. After a while I said, "How do you do that?" She said, "Do what?" I said, "Say the exact thing." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "I've been watching you for a year and a half, Cal. I know what you're actually made of. I'd say you're the last to know, except I think you know. You just need someone to say it out loud sometimes." She looked at me then directly, the same way she'd looked at me across the stage depot on that Thursday afternoon in March, and I understood. It landed in me fully, without ambiguity, that she wasn't saying this to comfort me. She was saying it because it was true, and she was the kind of woman who said true things, and she had observed me carefully for 18 months, and this was her honest assessment. Nobody had said anything like that to me in 6 years, maybe longer. I put my arm around her, just my arm, pulling her against my side, her shoulder against my ribs, and she let me. And she put her hand on my chest, and we sat there with our backs against a fence post. I'd just driven into the ground on land I just bought, and the summer heat coming up off the Borden's flat plains, and it was the most I had felt at home in myself since I could remember. After a while she said, "Can you ride back, or do I need to get the wagon?" I said, "I can ride." She said, "Good, because the wagon's a 3-mile round trip." I said, "You'd have done it." She said, "Obviously, but I'd have been annoyed about it." I laughed, actual laughter which I don't do often. She pulled back and looked at me and smiled, a real smile, not a polite one, a smile that went all the way up, and it was the first time I'd seen her smile like that, and I thought, there it is. We rode back together in the late afternoon light. The 3rd year the range got dry. Not catastrophically dry, but dry enough to feel, shorter grass, lower creek, the cattle working harder for what they needed. It was the kind of summer that takes a small operation down a notch if the small operation isn't careful. We were careful. Nora had been watching the grass since spring, and she'd moved the cattle earlier than I would have, off the south pasture and onto the creek flats where the moisture held longer. It cost us some effort and inconvenience, and saved us more than that in the weight of the animals going into fall. There was a particular day in that dry June when the heat was bad and the wind was wrong, coming from the southwest, which meant it was pulling moisture out of everything it touched rather than bringing any in. And I was in the east pasture checking the grass height, crouching down and parting the stems with my hand the way my father had taught me, trying to count what was left before it wouldn't recover. The news was not good. The growth had stopped 2 weeks early, and what was standing was thinner than it should have been. I sat on my heels in the dry grass and thought about the numbers, which is a particular kind of thinking that a man in the ranching business does constantly, and that has no pleasure in it, pure arithmetic, weight of cattle against available feed against days until green up, trying to make the numbers say what you want them to say. I heard the bay before I saw her. She came over the low rise to the east at a steady walk, and she had a canteen, and she had the small satchel she carried when she rode out to work. She got down and looked at the grass herself, same as I had. She crouched and parted the stems and didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "The creek flats are holding better." I said, "I know." She said, "If we move them this week instead of July, we can hold the weight better going in." I said, "It crowds the timing on the creek flats." She said, "I know, we manage the timing." She stood up. "The creek flats or the feed bills, your choice." I stood up. I looked at the grass and I looked at her and I said, "The creek flats." She said, "That's what I thought." She handed me the canteen. "Drink something." That was the conversation. We moved the cattle that week and it was the right call. In August she rode the full perimeter of the north parcel, the Hendricks land, our land, and came back and said we needed to clean the secondary water channel that fed the north section, which had been silting up for years under Wendell Hendricks' tenure. It was a 2-week job, she estimated. She was right. It took 10 days. It was hard, dirty, low-down work in the heat, clearing silt from the channel with shovels and drag lines, and she worked beside me the whole time. Not asking to. Not making anything of it, just working. The second day at it, I stopped at noon and looked at her, mud on her arms to the elbow, her hair coming down from under her hat, sweat on her neck, and I thought, this woman came from Indiana by stage with one trunk, and she is in a drainage ditch with me in August, and she looks more at home here than most people look in their own parlors. She looked up and said, "What?" I said, "Nothing." She said, "You're looking at me like you want to say something." I said, "I was thinking you look like you belong here." She considered that. Then she said, "I do." She went back to the shovel. "Go on and get digging." When we were done, the water ran the way water is supposed to run, and the north pasture started coming back, slow but visible. Heck Faulkner rode out in September and stood at the fence line with me and looked at the cattle, which were in better shape than most of the operations in the county after that dry summer, and he said, "Whatever that woman of yours is doing, keep her doing it." I said, "I know." He said, "Half the ranchers east of here are selling down. You're holding." I said, "I know." He looked at me. He said, "How'd you end up with a woman like that from a notice in a newspaper?" I said, "I don't know, heck." He said, "You should figure it out. Might want to replicate the process." I said, "Absolutely not." He laughed and got back on his horse and rode back toward town. What Heck didn't say, but what I knew by then, was that the town had a particular way of talking about the two of us. Not gossip exactly. There was nothing for gossip to take hold of, more like assessment. Borden's Flat was a place that had known me for years as a solitary man who ran a decent ranch and paid his debts and kept to himself, and the town had a settled idea of me that was not unflattering but was also not large. A reliable man, a quiet man, a man who'd had a loss and absorbed it. Nora had done something to that picture without trying to. She hadn't changed who I was, she just illuminated it maybe. The east pasture doing better, the herd holding in the dry year, the Hendricks parcel. These were visible things in a small county, and people could see that the man they'd thought they knew had more in him than they'd credited, and that a woman had been the difference not by softening him, but by bringing out more of what was already there. Corbin said something to me at the feed store that fall. He was a man of few words himself, which I appreciated. He said, "Your place has come on this last couple years, Cal." He said it the way men say something true when they want to say it and don't want to make anything of it. I said, "Yes, it has." He said, "Smart woman." I said, "Yes." And that was all, and it was enough. That winter she got sick. Not badly sick. Not the kind of sick I couldn't bear the thought of, but sick enough. A hard chest cold that settled in for 3 weeks in January and took a hold on her that surprised me because Nora Aldicott did not, as a rule, let things take a hold on her. She was up and doing on the second day, which I stopped, and furious about being stopped, which I expected. I made her stay by the fire, and I did her work and mine, and she sat in the chair by the kitchen window watching me move around her domain, with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and frustration. On the 4th day she said, "You're reorganizing my preserves shelf." I said, "I'm dusting it." She said, "You're reorganizing." I said, "The order you had them in made no sense." She said, "It made perfect sense to me." I said, "You weren't here to use it." A pause, then, "Put them back." I put them back, in approximately the right order. She watched me from the chair, and after a while she said, "Cal." I said, "What?" She said, "Thank you." I said, "Don't thank me for doing the work. That's what you're here for too." She said, "I don't mean the work." I stopped. She said, "I mean being here. Doing this." She had her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and she looked at me across the kitchen with those gray-green eyes and she said quietly, "When my husband was sick I took care of him, every day for 2 months, and I was glad to do it. But there was no one," she stopped. "Then, there was no one taking care of me while I was taking care of him. I didn't expect there to be. I'd stopped expecting that." I said, "You don't have to stop expecting that." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "No, I've worked that out." I went back to the shelf and continued not reorganizing the preserves, and she sat in her chair, and after a while she said, "You put the apple butter in the wrong spot." I said, "I know. I did it on purpose." She made a sound that was half exasperation and half something warmer. By the 4th year people had stopped remarking on us, which is the best thing that can happen to a marriage in a small town. When you're new, it's a subject. When you're 4 years old, you're just part of the landscape, and that suited us both fine. The ranch was solid, 240 acres working well, a herd that was improving year on year, the house maintained, the accounts in order. We'd had 2 dry summers and 1 hard winter and come through each of them without losing ground. The kitchen garden was so productive by year 3 that Nora had taken to selling preserves at Heck's General Store, which was not something I'd expected but which struck me, when I thought about it, as exactly the kind of thing she would do. She had made friends, or what passed for friends with a woman like Nora, not the gushing kind, not the afternoon tea kind, but real connections with the women who worked hard and said what they thought. Vera Hendricks, whose husband had sold us the land and who Nora had taken on as a kind of project of dignified charity, which Nora would have rejected as a description. And Marta Sousa, who was Portuguese, who'd married a sheep man south of town and who spoke plainly and worked with her hands, and was about as subtle as a fence post, which is apparently what Nora found appealing. In the spring of year 4, a young man named Ellis Pryor came asking about work. He was maybe 23, a farm boy from Missouri who'd come west looking for something and hadn't found it yet. He had the look of a young man who was capable and uncertain simultaneously, which is a difficult combination to manage, and which I remembered dimly from 30 years before. I took him on for the spring and summer. He was a good worker, not experienced but willing, which you can teach from. He learned quickly. He made the mistakes that new men make, and then he didn't make them again. One evening near the end of June, he was sitting on the step of the barn eating his supper, and I was coming in from the far pasture, and he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He said, "Mr. Deer, can I ask you something?" I said, "Go ahead." He said, "How do you know what you're doing?" I looked at him. He was looking at the ground, a little embarrassed now. He said, "I mean, you do things and they work. The east pasture and the Hendricks water. You just know what to do." I said, "I don't always know what to do." He looked up. I said, "I knew the east pasture was better ground because I've been on this land for 20 years and I pay attention. And the water channel, that was my wife. She rode the perimeter and saw what needed doing." He thought about that. He said, "But how do you get to where you just know things?" I said, "You watch, you pay attention to what goes wrong and why. You find people who know more than you do and you listen to them." I paused. "And you stay long enough. You can't know a place in a season. You have to stay." He nodded slowly. I said, "You looking to stay somewhere, or are you still moving?" He said, "Honestly, I don't know yet." I said, "That's a fair answer." He finished his supper and went to bed, and I went into the house where Nora was at the table writing, and I sat down and I thought about what I'd said to him. You stay. You pay attention. You find people who know more than you do and you listen. I'd had to be 51 years old and 6 years alone before I'd done the last one. Before I'd written a notice in a plain voice and let someone come and see me plainly. I thought about that for a while, and I let it be what it was, a thing I'd gotten to late, better than not at all, and then I poured myself coffee and went to bed. I had not expected her to build something in the community so efficiently, and the fact that she had told me something I'd failed to appreciate fully. She was a person who made a place wherever she went. Not by luck or charm, but by seeing clearly, showing up reliably, and saying what was true. Which is what she had done with me from the very first day. There was a night 5th year that I think about. It was late October. The first real cold had come and we'd been working hard, getting the last of the cattle settled for winter, laying in wood, the 100 preparations that a ranch demands when the season turns. We sat down late, both of us tired in the way that is almost pleasant, the earned kind, at the kitchen table after supper with the stove going and the wind starting outside. She was writing something, letters, I thought, maybe to Ireland. She had a sister there she wrote to. I was doing nothing in particular, which is something I'd learned to do again. For years after Ida, I couldn't sit without working. The stillness felt like reproach. With Nora, somehow, the stillness had come back as something that was just itself. Just a quiet evening and the fire and the lamplight and someone to share it with. She finished what she was writing and put the pen down and looked up. I said, "Ireland." She said, "Marta, she's got a land question I wanted to look into for her." I said, "What kind of land question?" She said, "Hers is hers and the county's trying to tell her it isn't." She said it with the particular flatness that meant she was annoyed and had already begun deciding what to do about it. I said, "You're getting involved." She said, "I'm helping her figure out what she has. Somebody should." I said, "You know you don't get paid for this." She looked at me. "Do I look like I'm doing it for pay?" I said, "No. You look like you're doing it because you can't help yourself." She considered that. "Then that's accurate." I said, "It's who you are." She said, "Is that a complaint?" I said, "No, the opposite." She looked at me across the kitchen table, her pen in her hand, the lamplight sitting in her gray-green eyes, and she said, "What does that mean, the opposite?" I said, "It means I think it's one of the best things about you. You can't see a thing going wrong without trying to fix it." A pause, then, You could have told me that earlier. I said, I'm telling you now. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'll tell you something back. I said, all right. She said, I came out here not knowing what I was going to get. I'd been careful about the letters. I thought you seemed decent, but I'd been wrong about men before, not about my husband, but before him. I'd misjudged badly once, and I didn't know if I was misjudging again. She looked at me. You weren't what I expected. I said, worse or better? She said, better, considerably. I said, what were you expecting? She said, a man who needed managing. Most men who write those notices need managing one way or another, too proud, too weak, too set something. I was prepared to manage whatever it was. I said, and? She said, and you just, she paused. You're a fair man, Cal. You're fair and you're steady and you work harder than any man I've known and you're honest about your limits and you change your mind when you're wrong. She held my gaze. Do you know how rare that is? I didn't answer. She said, I'm not flattering you. I say this to say it's true. I said, I know. She said, good, because I want you to know that I am not here because I had nowhere else to go. I'm here because this is where I would choose to be if I had any number of choices. I sat with that. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving across the plains with that particular sound it makes in October, a long cold rush against the walls of a solid house. I said, come here. She looked at me. I said, come here. She put her pen down. She stood up and came around the table and I pushed the chair back and she sat, not small, not fragile, tall and solid and warm and entirely herself. And I put my arms around her and she put her face against my shoulder. We sat like that for a while, the fire going, the wind outside. She said into my shoulder, I was right, you know. I said, about what? She said, the first day. I told you it was going to be all right. I said, you did. She said I was right. I said, you usually are. She pulled back just enough to look at me and that smile was there, the full one, the one I'd first seen in the meadow in the summer heat in the second year, and she said, get used to it. There is one more thing I want to tell, because it is the truest measure of what we'd built, and I don't want to leave it out. In the 6th year I had a bad spell with my health. Not dramatic, I want to say that plainly, not the kind of thing that ends a man. But I had a run of weeks in the fall when the back that had been bad for years got worse, and then a chest thing came on that wasn't serious but that wouldn't let me go, and by November I was running at about half what I needed to run at, and the ranch knew it. I am not a man who admits to that kind of thing easily. I'd been running at full speed for 30 years, and the idea of being the one who needed tending was, difficult is the right word. I did not like it. I pushed through more than I should have, and Nora watched me push through it for about 2 weeks, and then one morning she set a cup of coffee in front of me and sat down across the table and looked at me with those even gray-green eyes and said, "You're done pushing." I said, "I'm fine." She said, "You're not fine. You've been not fine for 2 weeks, and we both know it, and I'm tired of watching you pretend otherwise." I said, "There's work that needs doing." She said, "I know, I'll do it. Ellis will do it." Ellis Pryor had come back for a 2nd year and had turned into a real hand. "You will do what the doctor tells you and you will rest until you can work without hurting yourself further." I said, "Nora." She said, "Cal, stop." I stopped. She said, "You have been holding this place together since you were a young man. You have worked harder than any man I know, and you have done it without complaint and without asking anyone for anything. That is," she paused. Her voice stayed even, but there was something behind it. "That is who you are. It's the best of you. But it is not a sin to be the one who needs something for a while. It does not undo any of it." I looked at the table. She said, "You spent 6 years alone on this place. You didn't let anyone in. You didn't let anyone help. You managed everything yourself because that's what you had. but that is not what you have anymore." I said, "I know that." She said, "Then act like you know it." I looked at her. She said with less force but just as plainly, "Let me take care of you. That's what I'm here for. The same as you take care of things for me. That's what this is." I said, "I don't like being the one who can't do the thing." She said, "I know, but you can sit with not liking it for a few weeks if it means you're fully functional in the spring." She held my gaze. "You are worth taking care of. Do you understand that? Not the ranch, you, the man sitting in front of me, he is worth the trouble." I held very still. She had said things to me before, plain things, honest things, things that landed. But that one sat differently. Maybe because I was worn down and couldn't keep it at arm's length the way I normally did. Maybe because the 6 years of alone were still somewhere in me, and there was still a part of me that hadn't entirely believed, after all this time, that someone would choose to be here. Not for the ranch, not out of duty, but for me. For the actual, specific, difficult, 57-year-old man sitting at the kitchen table with a bad back and a chest that wouldn't clear. She was watching my face. She always knew when something landed. She said quietly, "I meant it." I said, "I know you did." I rested. Not without difficulty, but I rested. She ran the place alongside Ellis for those weeks, and she did it without making me feel small for it. And she came in at the end of every day and sat with me, and we talked more in those weeks than we'd talked in any single stretch before. Not about the ranch, just talked. The way people talk when the work is set aside for a while, and there's nothing to do but be present with each other. By December I was better. By January I was back at full or close enough. The first morning I was back out working the fence line I'd been meaning to fix for 2 weeks. She brought coffee out to me in the cold, wrapped in her coat, the steam off it rising in the gray light, and she handed it to me and stood there a moment. I said, "Thank you for all of it." She said, "Don't thank me." I said, "I'm going to anyway." She looked at me. Then she said, "Just come back in for supper," and she walked back to the house. I stood there with the coffee and the cold and the fence line running out into the winter grass, and I thought, this is it. This is the thing. Not the land or the cattle or the 240 acres. This woman walking back to the house in the gray morning, who looked at me and said, "You are worth taking care of," and meant it without condition or performance. I've been asked over the years about the marriage notice. Heck asks every couple of years, usually after some whiskey, with the kind of genuine wonder that a man like Heck applies to things he cannot quite explain. He says, "How did you know?" He says, "What made you write the notice that time when you'd been alone 6 years?" I never know exactly how to answer that. What I usually say is, I got tired of the alone, which is true but not the whole of it. The whole of it is harder to say. It's something like, I had built something worth sharing and I had no one to share it with, and after 6 years I understood that this was not going to fix itself. That waiting for something to arrive is not the same as going to meet it. And I had written a plain notice in a plain voice, without embellishment, and a woman in Indiana had read it 3 times and decided it sounded honest. And she had turned out to be right. She had come out here not knowing me, in the full understanding that this was a risk and a hardship and possibly a mistake, and she had looked at me plainly and assessed me, and decided I was worth the trip. That is what I have to sit with all these years later, not the land which is solid, not the ranch which is more than I ever expected to have at 51. Not even the day-to-day of a good life alongside a good woman, though that is considerable. It's the thing she said at the table, 5th year, in the lamplight. I'm here because this is where I would choose to be if I had any number of choices. A woman like Nora Aldicott Deer has choices. She always has. She made that plain from the first letter. She came west not from desperation but from decision, and she had decided on me, and she had kept deciding, year after year, and that is what I think about when I sit on the porch in the evening. She is usually beside me, reading or thinking or watching the light go down the way she has watched it since the first fall we were together. The planes go on and on from the porch, and in the right light, the October light especially, they are the color of old copper, and the sky above them is the particular blue that exists nowhere else in the world that I have seen. She will put down her book sometimes and say nothing, just sit. And I will sit beside her, and the quiet will be the same quiet we have always had, not the silence of one man in an empty house, but the silence of two people who don't need to fill it. The fence lines run out past the edge of sight on both sides, north and south, and they are good fence, solid posts, tight wire, every one of it built by my hands or hers. The cattle are easy in the pasture below. The evening comes down slow and generous. That is enough. It has always been enough, once you have somebody to sit with when it comes.